The alarm over the east wall gatehouse went off at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, and I was moving before the third note finished sounding. I have told this story more times than any other from my years at the palace at Harrowgate, and I still choose my words carefully when I tell it, because the honest truth sounds almost like an anticlimax next to how it felt while it was happening. Nobody was hurt that night. Nothing was stolen. No one meant anyone any harm at all. But for nearly 4 hours, a dozen of us stood in a ring around Princess Elara and her son with our hands ready on our weapons, certain that the worst might be true, and I have never in 14 years of service been more afraid, or more proud of the men and women standing shoulder to shoulder with me. My name is Corwin Hale. I hold the rank of sergeant in the household division, and that autumn I was posted to the personal protection detail assigned to Princess Elara, wife of Crown Prince Rowan and her 3 children. On the night in question, the youngest, Princess Malin, and the baby of the family, Prince Bram, were both away from Harrowgate, staying with their aunt Princess Adela at her country residence for a few days while renovations were finished in the nursery wing. Only the eldest, Prince Torin, then 11 years old, was at the palace with his mother. I want to be plain about something from the very start, because I know how these stories get told and retold until the facts wear thin as an old coin. Nothing that happened that night had anything to do with anyone inside that family or anyone inside those walls who loved them. The threat, such as it was, came from outside the perimeter, and by the time the sun came up it had a name, a face, and an explanation so ordinary that half of us laughed about it before the week was out. But laughing about it afterward does not change what it felt like to live through it not knowing that yet. And it does not change what the Corps did right, which is the real reason I still think about that night at all. I had been on the overnight rotation for 6 days running, which meant I knew the rhythm of the princesses' wing better than I knew my own house by that point. Elara kept a modest routine for someone of her position, lights out in Torin's room by 8:30 on school nights, her own study lamp burning until midnight more often than not, correspondence and reading she preferred to do after the day's public duties were behind her. I had walked the corridor outside her apartments more times than I could count, and in 6 days of quiet I had grown, if I am honest, a little complacent about how quiet it would stay. The storm had rolled in from the coast that afternoon, the kind of weather the older guards called a wall rattler. Heavy rain driven sideways by gusts that came in from the sea with nothing to slow them down until they hit Harrowgate's stone. By midnight the wind was strong enough that I had heard branches coming down somewhere out past the kitchen gardens, a series of cracks like distant rifle fire that made every guard on the outer rotation flinch the first few times before we got used to it. The rain had knocked out 2 of the exterior floodlights along the west terrace earlier in the evening, and Captain Voss had already dispatched a maintenance team to look at them, grumbling the whole way about doing electrical work in a squall. None of that alarmed me. Storms happened. Branches fell, lights blew, and the palace stood through worse every year. What alarmed me was the specific tone of the klaxon that sounded at 11 minutes past 2, because Harrowgate's alarm system was not a single note. It had a vocabulary, and every guard on the household detail learned that vocabulary in their first month of training the way a soldier learns to recognize incoming fire by its whistle before the shell lands. A single long blast meant fire. 2 short blasts repeated meant a medical emergency somewhere on the grounds, and 3 short blasts, repeated without pause, meant only one thing: a confirmed breach of the outer perimeter. I heard 3 short blasts. I was on the 2nd floor of the household wing when it started, half a corridor from Elara's apartments, and I do not remember consciously deciding to run. I simply found myself moving, my hand already on my radio, my mind already sorting through the protocol I had drilled 100 times and never once, in 6 years on this specific detail, actually had to use for real. Hail to command. I have the alarm, confirm nature of breach, I said into the radio as I moved. keeping my voice as level as I could make it, because panic in a guard's voice on an open channel spreads faster than any actual danger does. The response came back clipped and fast, Captain Halden Voss's voice, and I could hear in it that he was already running too. Confirmed breach, east wall perimeter, sensor grid triggered at 3 points along the boundary fence near the kitchen gardens. Unable to confirm nature of intrusion, visual obscured by weather. All household units, execute condition amber immediately. I say again, execute condition amber. Condition amber. Every guard at Harrowgate knew what that meant without needing to think about it, because thinking about it was exactly what the drilling was meant to remove from the equation. It meant we did not wait to find out whether the breach was serious before we acted as though it might be. It meant every member of the royal household inside Harrowgate's walls was to be located, secured, and surrounded by a protective ring of guards within minutes. Not because anyone believed with certainty that danger had reached the family, but because the entire purpose of the protocol was to make sure that if it ever did, the family would already be safe before anyone had to find out the hard way. I reached Elara's outer door 40 seconds later, and I was not the first. Corporal Sable F. Franken was already there, radio in one hand, the other resting on the doorframe as though she could hold the whole wing steady by touch alone. She had been posted just down the corridor that night, closer than I was, and her face when she looked at me was set in the particular calm that good guards learn to wear over fear the way you'd pull on a coat. No visual confirmation on what tripped it, she said, before I could even ask. Voss says 3 sensor points along the east wall near the kitchen gardens, all within about 90 seconds of each other. Could be one intruder moving fast. Could be more than one. Or it could be a branch, I said, because some part of me was still hoping to say it out loud and have it be true. Could be, Sable agreed. We don't get to assume that. She was right, and I knew she was right, and neither of us hesitated another second before she knocked twice, firmly, on Elara's door, and called through it in the clear, unhurried voice we were trained to use precisely because it does not sound unhurried by accident. It takes practice to sound calm when your heart is going like a hammer. Your Highness, it's Corporal F. Franken and Sergeant Hale. We need to come in. Security matter, non-negotiable. There was no more than 3 seconds of silence before the door opened, and in that gap I found myself doing what I always did in those situations, which was picturing the door not opening at all, pushing it in. If it came to that, protocol allowing for exactly that outcome. Doors being a much smaller thing to break than the alternative. But it did open, and Elara stood there in a robe pulled hastily over her nightclothes, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face already alert in a way that told me she had heard the alarm herself and had been waiting, not sleeping, for someone to come explain it to her. I want to say something here about Princess Elara, because I think it matters to how the rest of that night went. She had been married into this family for more than a decade by then, long enough to have absorbed its instincts the way anyone absorbs the habits of the house they live in. And one of those instincts, the most important one as far as guards like me were concerned, was this. She did not argue with the protocol. She had been briefed on Condition Amber like every adult member of the household. She understood exactly what it meant and exactly why it existed. And in the moment it was invoked for real for the first time in her life, she did not waste 1 second of anyone's time asking whether it was necessary. Torin, she said, already turning back into the room, already moving toward the connecting door to her son's bedroom. Tell me what's happening while I get him. Perimeter breach, east wall near the kitchen gardens, Sable said, following her in, me a half step behind. Sensors triggered at multiple points. We don't have a visual confirmation yet of what caused it. Protocol requires us to secure you and the prince immediately and treat it as a credible threat until it's cleared. Understood, Elara said, and she did not slow down as she said it. She was already through the connecting door. I heard her wake her son the way I imagine any mother might, low and steady, no panic in it at all, even though I knew, having stood outside enough doors and heard enough voices through enough walls over the years, that steadiness like that does not come free. It costs something to produce it on command. Torin, love, I need you to wake up and come with me. Nothing's wrong, but we need to move to another part of the palace for a little while. I heard the boy's voice, thick with sleep and then quickly sharpening. Is it a fire? No, it's a security thing. The guards need us to move, that's all. Put your slippers on. I will admit that I held my breath a little at that exchange, because I had two younger cousins near Torin's age back in the village I grew up in, and I knew how fast a child could go from groggy to frightened once the word, security, entered a sentence at 2 in the morning. But Torin came out of that room a minute later dressed, more or less, in a jumper pulled on over his pajama top and his slippers on the wrong feet, and though his eyes were wide and his hair was a wreck, he was not crying, and he was not asking questions faster than any of us could answer them. He looked, more than anything, like a boy trying very hard to do exactly what he had probably been told to do in some briefing months or years earlier that he had likely half forgotten, until this exact moment reminded him all at once. "Sergeant Hale," he said when he saw me, and there was something almost like relief in it, the recognition of a familiar face in an unfamiliar situation. I had walked him to the stables more mornings than I could count that autumn, one of the small, ordinary duties that came with being posted to a family's detail long enough that the children stopped treating you like furniture and started treating you like a person who happened to always be nearby. "Good morning, Your Highness," I said, and I meant to sound light about it, because a boy that age reads a guard's tone faster than he reads the guard's words. Bit early for a walk, but here we are. It got the smallest flicker of a smile out of him, which was worth more to me in that moment than almost anything else that happened that night. Sable was already on the radio again, coordinating with Captain Voss on where we were to take them. Standard doctrine called for moving the family away from any exterior wall and toward the interior of the palace, ideally a room with a single reinforced entry point and no windows accessible from ground level, while a full sweep of the grounds was carried out. Harrowgate had 3 such rooms designated and prepared for exactly this purpose, unglamorously referred to by the Guard Corps as Hold 1, Hold 2, and Hold 3, though I never once heard anyone from the family use those names. Hold 2 was the nearest to Elara's apartments, a windowless anteroom off the old library on the ground floor, originally built as a strong room for the palace archives 100 years earlier and repurposed, decades ago, for exactly this kind of night. "Hold 2, Sable said, lowering the radio. "Captain Voss wants you moved now, Your Highness. I'll take point, Sergeant Hale takes the rear, we'll have 2 more join us at the stairwell." "Lead the way," Elara said, and she took her son's hand and we moved. I do not think most people understand, unless they have done this work, how strange it is to walk quickly and quietly through a place at once so familiar and so changed. I had walked that corridor 1,000 times in daylight, past the same tapestries, the same tall windows now black with storm and streaked with rain, the same worn patch in the runner carpet where 3 generations of guards had turned the same corner the same way. In the ordinary hours of the day, it was simply a hallway. That night it felt like a throat we were moving down, every doorway a place something could be waiting, every gust of wind against the windows, a sound my body flinched at before my mind caught up and told it not to. We picked up Private Ewan Dresk and Private Bet Corrigan at the main stairwell exactly as planned, both of them arriving at a controlled run from opposite ends of the ground floor. And by the time we reached the door to Hold 2, we numbered 5 guards around 1 woman and 1 boy, which even in the tension of the moment struck me as something close to overwhelming. 5 trained adults with sidearms forming a wall around an 11-year-old in slippers on the wrong feet. But that is precisely the point of the protocol, and I have never once before or since resented what it asks of us. The ratio is meant to feel like too much. That is what makes it work. Hold 2's door was reinforced steel behind a plain wooden facing that made it look, to anyone who did not know better, like any other panel in the library's paneled wall. Sable had the key from the ring she carried on duty, and she had the door open and the lights on inside within seconds. It was a small room, no more than 4 meters across, furnished sparsely with 2 chairs, a low table, a cot folded against one wall for exactly this kind of long night, and a heavy steel door on the far side leading to a second, smaller chamber that had no other exit at all. The innermost point, the place we would go only if the outer room itself were somehow compromised, which had never once happened in the room's 100-year history, and which none of us that night seriously expected to happen either. Protocol prepares for the unlikely. It does not predict it. "You'll be safest in here for now, Your Highness," Sable said, gesturing Elara and Torin inside. "We'll have someone posted at this door and along the corridor the entire time. As soon as command clears the grounds, we'll come get you." Elara sat down in one of the chairs, pulled Torin gently onto the seat beside her, and looked up at the 4 of us now filling the doorway with the particular composure I had heard about but never quite seen up close before that night. "How bad is it?" she asked, quietly enough that I understood the question was meant for us as professionals, not as a piece of reassurance she was fishing for in front of her son. "We don't know yet, Your Highness," I said, because I believed then, as I still believe now, that the family we protected deserved the truth delivered plainly, not softened into something easier and less useful. 3 sensor points went off within about 90 seconds of each other along the east wall, near the kitchen gardens. Visibility's poor because of the storm. Captain Voss has teams moving to investigate now. Until we know more, we're going to keep you here, and we're going to keep this door between you and anything that might be out there. Torin, who had been quiet through all of this, finally spoke, and his voice, though it shook a little at the edges, was steadier than I expected from a boy his age at 2:30 in the morning. "Is someone trying to get into the palace?" I crouched down slightly, not so far as to seem as though I were talking down to him, but enough to put my eyes closer to his level, because I had learned over the years that children answer questions better and hear answers better when the adult in front of them is not looming. "That's what we're trying to find out right now, Your Highness. It might be nothing at all. Storms like this knock all sorts of things loose, and sometimes that's enough to set the sensors off on its own. But until we know for certain, our job is to make sure that whatever it is, it has to get through all of us before it gets anywhere near you. And that's not going to happen." He looked at me for a moment, weighing that, the way children do when they are deciding whether an adult is telling them something true or something meant only to make them feel better. Whatever he found in my face seemed to satisfy him, at least for the moment, because he nodded once and settled back against his mother's side. "Radio silence on this channel except for command traffic," Sable said to the rest of us, stepping back out into the corridor. "Corrigan, you're on the door. Dresk with me, we're going to walk the corridor and check the 2 access points off the east stair." "Hail." "I'll stay," I said before she finished, and she gave me a short nod, because it had already been decided in the way these things get decided without a word actually needing to be spoken. That of the 5 of us I was the one Torin knew best, and a familiar face in that room mattered as much just then as a rifle in the corridor. The door to hold 2 stayed open a crack, standard practice, enough that Elara and Torin were not shut away in total isolation while still keeping the room technically secured, and I took up a position just outside it, close enough to see them both, my back against the library shelves, my radio turned low but not off, listening to the first reports come in from the grounds. They were not in those first minutes reassuring. "Command, this is Voss, reporting from East Wall perimeter." The captain's voice was breathless, competing against wind noise on his end that told me he was standing directly in the teeth of the storm. "We have a confirmed breach in the fence line, Approximately 8 meters of the boundary fencing near the kitchen garden gate is down. Looks like it's been forced or fallen. Can't tell which in this light. No visual on any individual. I need floodlight units out here, and I need them now. Copy, Voss. Floodlight team is 15 minutes out. They were still working the West Terrace fault, came the reply from whoever was manning Central Command that night. I would learn later it was Commander Ealdrick Thorne himself, roused from his own quarters and already in the operations room by the time the second sensor had tripped. 15 minutes. I did the arithmetic without wanting to and did not like the answer. 15 minutes was a very long time to stand in the dark, not knowing what had come through a hole in your fence. I looked in through the gap in the door. Elara had her arm around Torin's shoulders, and she was talking to him in a low voice I could not quite make out the words of, though I could hear the rhythm of it, steady, unhurried, the sound of someone deliberately keeping a conversation moving so that the silence around it did not have room to grow teeth. Torin's slippers, I noticed for the first time, really were on the wrong feet, and there was something about that small, stupid detail. A boy who might that very moment be under a genuine threat, sitting in a windowless room with his slippers mismatched. That steadied something in my own chest more than any radio report could have. Whatever was out there in the storm, I told myself, it was going to have to come through the east wall, through the kitchen gardens, through the library corridor, through Corrigan at the door and Dresk and F. Franken in the hall and me at this threshold, before it reached that boy. I did not know yet what it actually was. None of us did. But I knew what my job was, and for the next several hours, that was the only thing I let myself think about. Word travels fast inside a palace, even at night, even in a storm, and it was not 10 minutes before I heard boots coming down the corridor at a pace that told me exactly who it was before I saw his face. Crown Prince Rowan came around the corner with his own protection officer, a broad, quiet man named Garrett Voss, no relation to the captain, a coincidence of surnames that had confused newer staff for years, half a step behind him, and clearly having failed to talk him into slowing down. "Where's my family?" Rowan said, not quite a question, already moving past me toward the door of Hold 2. I stepped, not quite into his path, but close enough to it that he had to check his stride, and I want to be honest about how uncomfortable that moment was, because there is very little training in the world that fully prepares a man for the experience of physically slowing down the future king's son on his way to his own wife and child. "They're safe, sir. Secured in Hold 2, door and corridor both covered. I need you to hold here just a moment while Corporal F. Franken confirms with command that it's clear to open the room up." "I don't need it confirmed, Sergeant. I need to see them." "I understand, sir. And I promise you, the fastest way to get you in that room is to let us do this by the book, because if I open that door for you without clearing it first, and it turns out I've made an exception I shouldn't have, the next person who wants an exception made might not be you." I said it as evenly as I could, because I meant every word of it, and because I had exactly one chance to say it before either he overruled me, which, as the future king's son, he had every right to do, or he didn't. He did not overrule me. I watched something in his face tighten, and then deliberately unclench, the visible effort of a man choosing discipline over instinct in real time, and I have thought about that moment more than once since, because I think it says something about the whole family, about what gets absorbed into a household over the years without ever being written down anywhere. "Fine," he said. "Confirm it. Fast." Sable was already on the radio. "Command, this is F. Franken at Hold 2. Crown Prince Rowan is present and requesting entry to confirm his family's status. Please advise." There was a pause, brief but real, and in it I watched Rowan's jaw work, watched Garrett Voss put a steadying hand near his elbow without quite touching him, the kind of gesture that says I am here and I am not going to grab you, but I am ready to if I need to. "Confirmed, F. Franken. "The Crown Prince may enter hold 2 under escort. No other personnel," came the reply, and I stepped aside so fast I nearly put my shoulder into the bookshelf behind me. I heard, rather than watched, most of what happened next, because I kept my eyes on the corridor the way I was supposed to rather than on a private family moment I had no business staring at. But I heard Torin's voice crack just slightly on the word Dad, and I heard Elara say something too quiet to make out, and I heard Rowan's voice, lower than I had ever heard it, saying, I'm here, you're all right," over and over in the particular cadence of a man reassuring himself as much as anyone else in the room. He stayed perhaps 90 seconds before Sable, gently but firmly, reminded him that command still needed the room to remain in restricted access, and that every extra person inside it was, technically, one more variable the protocol was designed to avoid. He came back out looking like a man who had aged and steadied all at once, the fear still in his eyes but banked now, controlled. And he did not go far. He took up a position against the far wall of the corridor, arms folded, and made it clear without a word that he intended to stay exactly there until this was over. "Where's my father?" he asked me, a few minutes later once his breathing had leveled out. "King Alaric's been informed, sir, as soon as Condition Amber was declared," I said. "Protocol has him and Queen Consort Morwenna secured in their own wing under a separate detail. I imagine you'll hear from him directly before long." As if the universe had been listening for its cue, my radio crackled with exactly that a minute later. Not the king himself, of course. Kings do not generally speak over guard channels in the middle of a security event, but a relayed message passed down through Commander Thorne's operations room confirming that His Majesty had been briefed, was secured, and had asked to be updated the moment there was anything definitive to report. I relayed as much to Rowan, who nodded once tightly and went back to staring at the far wall. It is a strange thing, standing guard over a family in a moment like that, because you become, whether you intend to or not, both a wall and a witness. I watched Rowan pace 3 steps one way and 3 steps back for the better part of 20 minutes, watched him check his own radio twice, though nothing new had come through it, watched him finally sit down on the floor of the corridor itself, back against the wall, less because it was comfortable and more, I think, because it put him physically lower and closer to the door his family was behind. As if proximity itself were a kind of protection he could offer even from the wrong side of a threshold, he was not permitted to cross again just yet. The reports from the grounds kept coming, in the clipped shorthand guards use on an open channel, and I tracked them the way I imagine a man might track whether moving in on a ship he could not leave. "Command Voss, floodlights are up on the east wall section now. I have the fence breach in full view. It's down across roughly 8 meters, post snapped clean in 2 places, not cut. This looks like something came through it, not someone who opened it." That last detail mattered more than it might sound like it should, and every guard on the channel would have understood immediately why. A person seeking entry, if they had planning enough to reach the fence line at all, generally does not simply run through it and snap the posts. They cut, they climb, they find the weak point and exploit it quietly, because noise and damage draw exactly the kind of attention that had in fact been drawn. Something crashing straight through a fence line with enough force to snap 2 posts sounded far more like an animal than a person, and I felt the first thin thread of hope work its way into my chest, though I was careful not to let it show on my face, because hope is a dangerous thing to wear on a night like that until it has been earned. "Copy that, Voss. Continue the sweep. I want confirmation before we downgrade anything." Commander Thorne's voice came back, level and unhurried in a way that I found, oddly, more reassuring than anything else I had heard all night. Thorne had run Harrowgate security for 19 years by that point, had seen every kind of false alarm, and, I would learn much later, 2 genuine incidents in his career serious enough that he still would not discuss the details of either. and his voice on the channel that night carried the particular calm of a man who had learned exactly how much urgency to allow himself, and exactly how much to withhold until the facts caught up. For the better part of the next half hour, the reports came in fragments, guards moving in pairs along the fence line and out into the kitchen gardens beyond it with flashlights, and the newly restored floodlights cutting through the rain, calling in what they found piece by piece. A trampled bed of late cabbages. A section of the ornamental hedge crushed flat. Hoofprints, real ones. Unmistakable, deep and staggered in the mud in a pattern that told an experienced tracker like Private Dresk, who had grown up on a hill farm before he ever joined the Corps, that whatever had made them had been moving fast and in a straight line, not circling, not searching, simply running. Command, this is Dresk. I've got clear hoofprints leading from the fence breach straight across the kitchen garden and into the ornamental hedge on the far side. Deer, almost certainly. The gate's too long and the prints too spaced for anything smaller. My money's on a red stag, spooked by the storm, maybe by a lightning strike close by, came through the weak section of fence at a dead run and just kept going. I let out a breath I had not entirely realized I was holding, and across the corridor I saw Rowan's head come up sharply at the words, hope moving across his face as plainly as it had moved through my chest a few minutes earlier. Copy, Dresk, keep tracking. I want eyes on the animal itself or confirmation it's left the grounds before I call this, Thorn said. And even in my relief, I understood exactly why he refused to relax the protocol on the strength of hoofprints alone. 3 sensor points had triggered in that sequence along the fence. A single running animal could plausibly account for all 3, moving fast enough across a wide enough stretch of ground to hit sensor after sensor in close succession. The timing lined up. 90 seconds was not an unreasonable span for a startled stag covering that kind of distance. But plausible was not the same as confirmed, and Thorn had not built a 19-year career on plausible. I relayed what I had heard quietly through the gap in the door to Elara because I had promised her the truth as it came and I intended to keep that promise. It looks like it might have been an animal, Your Highness. A deer, spooked by the storm, came through the fence line. They're tracking it now to be sure, but the signs are looking good. She closed her eyes for just a moment, the first real crack I had seen in her composure all night, and when she opened them again there was something almost like a laugh caught behind them, not quite ready to come out yet but present, waiting. A deer, she said. All of this for a deer. We don't know that for certain yet, Your Highness, I said, careful not to let my own relief run ahead of the facts the way I had just watched Thorn refuse to let his. But it's looking that way. Torin, beside her, had perked up considerably at this news, the particular resilience of childhood already working to convert what had been terrifying 20 minutes earlier into something almost exciting. A deer broke the fence. Like ran right through it. Sound that way, Your Highness? He seemed to be searching for the right word, and landed, with the total sincerity only an 11-year-old could manage in a moment like that on. That's actually really cool. I heard Rowan across the corridor make a sound that was half laugh and half something closer to a sob, quickly swallowed, and I understood it completely, because I felt something very similar loosen in my own chest. We were not out of it yet. Thorn had not called it, but for the first time since the alarm sounded, the shape of the night had shifted from something with teeth to something that might, very soon, turn out to be almost funny. I should have known better than to let myself think that. I had been in this line of work long enough to know that the moment you let your guard down even a fraction, the moment relief starts to feel like certainty, is exactly the moment a night like that one likes to remind you it isn't finished with you yet. It was another 12 minutes before Dresk's voice came back over the channel, and this time there was nothing relieved in it at all. Command, Dresk. I have visual on the animal. Confirmed red stag, caught up in a tangle of fallen fence wire near the ornamental hedge. Looks like it's been struggling to free itself for some time. It's exhausted, not going anywhere fast. This accounts for the fence breach and at least 2 of the 3 sensor triggers. A pause, and I heard, even through the radio static and the rain, the particular tightness that comes into a guard's voice when they are about to say something they wish they weren't. But I'm looking at the sensor log command just pushed to my handset, and the 3rd trigger point doesn't line up with this animal's path. It's nearly 40 meters from where the stag came through, on the far side of the kitchen gardens near the old garden sheds, and it tripped 11 seconds after the second one, which is too fast for this stag to have covered that ground and looped back around. Command, I don't think one animal accounts for all 3 triggers. I think we may have a second point of entry. I felt the relief in my chest go cold and drop straight through the floor. Across the corridor, Rowan had gone very still, and I understood, watching him, that he had heard every word of that transmission just as clearly as I had, because Sable had not thought to lower the volume on her radio fast enough. And there are some words a father simply cannot be shielded from once they are already spoken aloud into a corridor his son is sitting behind a door in. Command copies Dresk. All units, this is Thorn. Condition Amber remains in full effect. Repeat, remains in full effect. I want a second search team moving to the garden shed area immediately. Full lights, full caution. Household units. Tighten the perimeter around all family holds. I say again, tighten the perimeter. This is not yet clear. I looked through the gap in the door at Elara, who had gone very quiet, her arm tightening around her son's shoulders, and at Torin, whose earlier delight at the idea of a deer breaking through a fence had drained out of his face entirely, replaced by the same wide, careful watchfulness I had seen when he first came out of his bedroom that night. "Sergeant Hale," Elara said, and her voice had lost none of its steadiness, but there was a new weight behind it now, a mother doing arithmetic she did not want to be doing. "What does that mean?" I did not have a comforting answer for her, and I had promised her the truth, so I gave her the only one I had. "It means we're not finished yet, Your Highness. It means there might be more than one thing out there tonight. And it means we're going to stay exactly where we are, and exactly as careful as we've been, until we know for certain what it is." I keyed my radio, my eyes still on the door, on the woman and boy behind it, on the future king's son now standing again in the corridor with his hands pressed flat against the wall behind him as though he could feel, through the stone, whatever was happening out there in the dark. "Command, this is Hale at Hold 2. Family status unchanged, secure, no incidents. Standing by." Standing by. It was the truest thing I said all night, and also, in its way, the hardest, because standing by, when everything in you wants to move, wants answers, wants the night to simply be over one way or another, is very often the whole of the job. Commander Thorne's voice came back over the channel less than a minute later, and this time there was a decision in it, the kind of decision that gets made fast because the alternative is worse. "All household units, this is Thorn. Given the confirmed second entry point, I'm escalating. Move all family holds to secondary containment. Repeat, secondary containment, effective immediately. I want the innermost chambers sealed, and I want additional personnel on every hold door." This is not a drill, and it is not yet resolved. Secondary containment meant the steel door at the back of Hold 2, the smaller chamber with no other way in or out, the room none of us had ever expected to actually use. Sable was already moving to open it, and I stepped into the outer room properly for the first time that night, crossing to where Elara and Torin sat. "Your Highness, we need to move you through to the inner room," I said. "It's smaller, but it's the most secure space in the palace." This is Commander Thorne's decision, not a sign that anything's gotten worse than we already know. It's exactly the kind of caution the protocol is built for. Elara was on her feet before I finished the sentence, pulling Torin up with her, and I noted, not for the first time that night, how little persuading she required. "Whatever keeps him safest," she said. "Lead on." The inner chamber was smaller than I had described it, in truth, barely large enough for the two of them. The cot Sable had wheeled through, and one guard at a time inside with them. The rest of us stacking up in the outer room and the corridor beyond it in a formation that, had anyone been able to see it from above, would have looked less like a ring now and more like the concentric rings of a target, layer after layer of us between the door and the two people at the center. I did not love the metaphor even as it occurred to me, and I put it away as fast as I could, because a guard who starts thinking of the people he protects as the bullseye of anything is a guard whose focus has drifted somewhere it should not go. Rowan came to the threshold of the outer room and stopped there, understanding without being told that the inner chamber's capacity did not extend to him, not while the situation remained unresolved, and I watched him make peace with that the same way he had made peace with waiting outside the first door. Not gladly, not easily, but completely, because whatever else that family had or lacked. I never once saw any of them fight the guard corps on a point of safety, once the reasoning had been laid out plainly in front of them. It is, I have come to believe, one of the quieter reasons the protocol works at all. It only functions if the people at its center trust it, and trust, in my experience, is not something a family develops in the middle of a crisis. It is something built up over years of ordinary nights when nothing happens at all, one small compliance at a time, until the extraordinary night arrives, and the habit is already there waiting to be used. Torin, once settled on the edge of the cot in the inner chamber, looked up at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because I had worn something close to it myself more than once as a much younger man standing my first real posts. It was the look of someone doing the math on how frightened he was allowed to let himself look. "You don't have to pretend for me, Your Highness," I said, quietly, crouching again to bring myself down near his level. "It's all right to be scared. I'd think less of you if you weren't a little." "Are you scared?" he asked, and there was something almost like a challenge in it, the particular bluntness children bring to questions adults spend their whole lives learning to dodge. I could have lied to him. I have thought about it since, whether it would have been the kinder thing, the more professional thing, the thing a guard is supposed to do, project unshakable calm at all costs, let the frightened take their courage from your borrowed stillness. But I did not lie to him, and I am glad, looking back, that I didn't. "A bit, yes," I said. "Not because I think anyone here is going to come to harm. 5 trained guards stand between that door and this room, and there'll be more before the hour's out. I'm careful, Your Highness, not because I expect the worst, but because expecting the worst and preparing for it anyway is the only way to make sure it never actually happens. That's the whole trick of this job, if you want to know the truth of it. We're careful so you never have to find out whether we needed to be." He considered that for a long moment, his mother's hand resting lightly on his back, and then he asked the question I think had been sitting underneath everything else since the alarm first sounded. "What if it's a person, out there? What if it's someone who wants to hurt us?" "Then he has to get past every single one of us first," I said, and I did not soften it, because I did not think softening it would have served him at all. And I have never, in 14 years, seen anyone get past this core when it mattered. Not once. It was true when I said it, and it remained true by the time the sun came up, though I would be lying if I said I felt entirely certain of it in that exact moment, with the rain still hammering the stone above us and the radio still silent on any update from the garden sheds. The silence, in fact, stretched longer than any of us liked. 10 minutes passed with nothing but routine check-ins on the channel. Corrigan confirming the corridor clear, F. Franken confirming the outer room secure. A brief exchange between 2 units coordinating a sweep of the ground floor windows along the east face of the building. I found myself counting the seconds between transmissions the way you count the gap between lightning and thunder, trying to measure how far away trouble still was. It was Dresk's voice again that finally broke the pattern, and this time it came with an edge in it I had not heard from him before, low and tight and entirely focused. Command Dresk reporting from the garden shed area. I have a visual. There's a light, small, handheld, moving inside the second shed from the east, the old tool store. Whoever's in there is trying to be quiet about it, but the light keeps giving them away through the gaps in the boarding. I don't have a clear view of numbers. Requesting backup before I approach. Copy Dresk, hold position, backup inbound, Thorne's voice replied, and I heard in the background of the transmission the sound of at least 2 more sets of boots already moving at a run. I looked down at Torin, whose eyes had gone very round at the words alight, moving inside the shed, and I made a decision in that instant that I have never once regretted, though it was not, strictly speaking, part of any script I had been trained to follow. Someone's in the tool shed, I told him plainly, because I had promised him the truth, and because I thought a boy who had just asked me directly whether someone wanted to hurt his family deserved better than to be left imagining the worst in silence, while I said nothing at all. Our people are moving in carefully to find out who and why. That's a good sign, Your Highness, not a bad one. An animal doesn't carry a torch. A person can be reasoned with. A person can be stopped without anyone getting hurt, and that's exactly what our people are trained to do. But it could still be someone bad, he said, and it was not really a question. It could, I agreed, because there was no honest way around that fact, not yet. But I'd remind you of something, Your Highness, if you'll let me. Whoever is in that shed is alone, on foot, in a storm, hiding with a torch he can't quite keep from giving himself away. That is not what a serious threat to this family looks like. In my experience, and I've been doing this a long time now, the people who mean real harm plan far better than that, and they very rarely announce themselves by fumbling around with a light in a garden shed 40 meters from the nearest fence. I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it happens to be true, and because you asked me a straight question, and you deserve a straight answer. He nodded slowly, and beside him, Elara caught my eye over the top of his head and gave me the smallest, most grateful look I think I have ever received in the line of duty. The kind of look that told me I had said exactly the right thing without either of us needing to discuss it afterward. The channel went quiet again, and this time the quiet had a different texture to it, the particular held-breath silence of a dozen trained people converging on a single small building in the dark, each of them saying nothing because there was nothing useful left to say until someone actually reached the door. I do not know exactly how long that silence lasted. It felt, standing in that inner chamber with a boy watching my face for any flicker of alarm, like a very long time indeed, though I would learn afterward from the official log that it was just short of 4 minutes. 4 minutes of rain drumming on stone far above us, of Elara's hand moving in slow circles on her son's back, of Rowan's shadow just visible through the gap in the outer door, still standing exactly where he had planted himself, refusing to sit, refusing to pace, simply standing and waiting the way a man waits for news he cannot control the timing of. Then the radio crackled, and Dresk's voice came through it again, and this time it was carrying something entirely different from what it had carried in every transmission before it. It was not fear. It was not tension. It was something closer to bewilderment laced, unmistakably, with relief. Command Dresk. I have a pause, as though he were choosing his next words with unusual care, or perhaps simply trying not to laugh at them. Command, I have one individual in custody, unarmed, non-resistant. Male, late teens, no weapon on his person, no equipment beyond a torch and a canvas tool bag. He says his name is Osric Vane. He says he's a fencing contractor's apprentice, and he was here earlier today working on a completely different section of the boundary wall. And he says he came back tonight because he left his master's ladder on the grounds, and he was afraid of what would happen if it went missing overnight in the storm. I felt the whole of my body loosen at once, a physical sensation I have never fully been able to describe to people who have not felt it themselves, like a held breath finally let go, after being held so long you'd half forgotten you were holding it. Say again, Dresk, Thorn's voice replied, careful, unwilling to celebrate on the strength of a single unverified account no matter how plausible it sounded. I want that confirmed before anyone downgrades anything. Bring him in for questioning, full search of his person and bag, and get me the contractor's details so we can verify his story before first light. Copy command, bringing him in now. I looked down at Torin, whose face had gone through an entire sequence of expressions in the space of that transmission: fear, confusion, and now something close to disbelief edging toward laughter. The same reaction his mother had had to the deer 20 minutes before, flaring up all over again, doubled. He came back for a ladder, Torin said, in the middle of a storm. At 2 in the morning. Sounds that way, Your Highness, I said, and I could not entirely keep the smile out of my own voice by then, though I made myself hold the rest of it in check, because Commander Thorn was right, and I knew he was right, and a story sounding plausible at 2:30 in the morning was not the same thing as a story being confirmed. But Commander Thorn's not calling this finished until he's checked every word of it, and neither am I. We stay exactly where we are until he says otherwise. That's a very silly reason to break into a palace, Torin said, and Elara, beside him, let out the laugh she had clearly been holding in check since the word deer had first crossed my lips 25 minutes earlier, quiet and disbelieving, and enormously relieved all at once. It is, Your Highness, I agreed, but you'd be surprised how often the silliest reasons turn out to be the true ones. Let's just make sure this is one of them before we celebrate. Even as I said it, some part of me, the part that had spent 14 years learning never to relax until the all-clear actually came, was still watching the door, still listening for the next transmission, still holding the last, smallest thread of caution I had left. Because a young man's name and a story about a ladder was not, on its own, proof of anything at all. It was only, at that point, the beginning of finding out whether the truth really could be as ordinary as it sounded. I learned the rest of Osric Vane's story, the way most of the Corps did, in pieces, over the following hour, first from the fragments that came across the radio, as Commander Thorn's team worked through their questioning, and later, more fully, from Dresk himself, who had been the one to physically find the boy, and who told the story afterward, more than once, in the guardroom over the following weeks, always with the same mixture of exasperation and fondness. Osric was 19 years old, in the second year of a 5-year apprenticeship, with a fencing and hedge-laying contractor called Merrick & Sons, a small family firm out of the market town of Aldbury that had held the maintenance contract for a section of Harrowgate's outer boundary fencing for close to 30 years. His master, a stern, exacting man named Tobias Merrick, had brought his crew in earlier that same day. The previous day, by the time the alarm had sounded, though it would always feel to me like the same unbroken night, to repair a different, unrelated stretch of fence along the western boundary, well away from where the stag had eventually come through, work that had been scheduled for weeks and had nothing whatsoever to do with the events that followed. The crew had packed up and left as the storm began building that evening, loading their van in a hurry as the first heavy rain came in off the coast, and it was not until Osric was back at the small flat he shared with 2 other apprentices above a bakery in Aldbury, some 40 minutes' drive from Harrowgate, that he realized, with the particular sick lurch of a young man who has made a genuine mistake, that he had left one of the firm's aluminum extension ladders leaning against a tree just inside the palace's outer boundary, forgotten in the scramble to beat the worst of the weather. It was not, in the scheme of things, an especially expensive ladder. Dresk told me later that when it was finally recovered and appraised, the thing was worth perhaps £80 new and considerably less than that second-hand. But to a 19-year-old 2 years into a 5-year apprenticeship, still very much on probation in every sense that mattered to him, working for a master known throughout Aldbury for his exacting standards, and his short temper on the subject of carelessness with tools, £80 and a lost ladder felt like considerably more than money. It felt, Osric told his questioners more than once that night, like the kind of mistake that got an apprentice let go before his contract was halfway finished. In a trade where apprenticeships were hard enough to come by, that losing one meant, quite possibly, losing the whole career before it had properly begun. He had not told anyone where he was going. That, more than anything else, was the detail that had made the night so much longer and so much more frightening than it needed to be for every single person inside Harrowgate's walls. And it was also, I think, the detail that told the rest of us the most about who Osric Vane actually was. He had not snuck back onto palace grounds in the dead of a storm because he intended any harm to anyone inside those walls. He had done it because he was young and frightened of disappointing a man whose good opinion he badly wanted to keep, and it had not once occurred to him, not until Private Dresk's torch beam found him crouched behind a stack of terracotta pots inside the old tool shed, breathless, soaked through, and clutching the very ladder he had come back for, that an entire royal household might spend the small hours of the morning in genuine terror on his account. "I didn't think," he told Dresk, over and over, according to the account Dresk gave in the guardroom afterward, in the particular repetitive, half-panicked way people talk when the full weight of a mistake finally lands on them all at once. "I swear I didn't think, I thought I could get in and out before anyone even knew I was here. I've walked past that bit of fence 100 times. I didn't know it was down. I didn't know there'd been an alarm at all until your torch was in my face. I swear I didn't mean." Dresk, by his own account, had needed the better part of a minute simply to convince the boy to stop apologizing long enough to answer a direct question. And by the time backup arrived to help walk him in, Osric was, in Dresk's words, shaking like a man who thought he was about to be shot, which was, when I heard it, a detail that sat uneasily with me for a long moment, because it was not a wholly unreasonable fear for him to have had. He had, after all, been caught trespassing on royal grounds in the dead of night during a declared security lockdown, by armed guards who had spent the better part of an hour believing his presence might represent the gravest kind of threat to the family they protected. I do not think Osric Vane fully understood, in that first shaking, soaked, terrified hour, quite how close he had come to being treated with a great deal more force than he ultimately was. And I think it is very much to the credit of the guards who found him, Dresk chief among them, that they read the truth of the situation quickly and correctly, and did not let the residual adrenaline of a long, frightening night curdle into anything harsher than it needed to be. That, I have come to believe, is its own kind of discipline, separate from, and every bit as important as the discipline it takes to stand still under provocation. It is the discipline required to look at a frightened, harmless young man in the middle of the worst night of your professional life, and recognize him immediately for exactly what he is, rather than for what your fear, still running hot in your blood, might otherwise convince you he could be. "Command Thorn." The commander's voice came over the channel again perhaps 20 minutes after Osric had first been brought in, and I could hear, even through the flatness he maintained on an open channel, that he had made up his mind about something. "I've spoken with the individual directly. His account is detailed, consistent, and he's provided contact information for his employer, a Master Tobias Merrick of Merrick & Sons, Aldbury, who holds the current maintenance contract for the western boundary fencing. I'm placing a call to Master Merrick now to verify employment and the work order for yesterday's repairs. Until that call is complete and confirmed, Condition Amber remains in effect. I want to be very clear with everyone on this channel. A plausible story is not a confirmed one, and we do not stand down on plausible." I relayed as much to Elara and Torin, who had by then moved back out of the smaller inner chamber and into the main room of Hold 2 at Sable's suggestion, on the reasoning that if the immediate threat truly had resolved to one exhausted stag and one terrified apprentice, there was little sense keeping an 11-year-old boy folded into the tightest, most airless room in the palace a moment longer than strictly necessary. Torin had visibly brightened at the extra space, though I noticed he stayed close to his mother's side regardless, one hand resting on the arm of her chair as though he needed the contact more than he needed the room. "How long does a phone call take?" Torin asked, with the particular impatience of a child who has just been told the frightening part might be over, but has not yet been told he can stop being frightened. "Depends on how many times it rings before a man wakes up enough to answer it sensibly," I said, and it earned me another small smile, though a strained one. "Could be 5 minutes, could be 20, if Master Merrick sleeps as heavily as some tradesmen I've known." It turned out to be closer to 15. And they were, if I am honest, some of the longer 15 minutes of the entire night, precisely because they came after the shape of the danger had already softened in all our minds, and yet the official word had not yet arrived to make that softening official. I have noticed, over the years, that the waiting that comes after you have started to believe the worst is over is its own particular kind of difficult. Harder in some ways than the waiting that comes while you still believe the worst might be true. Because by then, your body has already begun letting go of the readiness it spent the whole night holding, and asking it to keep holding a little longer takes a discipline all its own. Rowan, still in the corridor beyond the outer door, had by then been given the same summary the rest of us had, and I watched him through the gap. He had not come back into the room himself, respecting, even now, the boundary of who was and was not permitted inside a hold during an active lockdown, though I suspect it cost him a great deal to keep respecting it. He had his phone in his hand, though of course there was no one to call and nothing useful it could tell him that the radio traffic wasn't already telling him faster, and I understood, watching him turn it over and over without ever actually using it, that he simply needed something to hold on to that was not the wall. It was Commander Thorn's voice, finally, that ended the waiting, and I will remember the particular cadence of it for the rest of my life, because it was the first time all night that his tone carried something other than careful, level caution. "All units, this is Thorn. I have confirmed, by direct telephone conversation with Master Tobias Merrick of Merrick & Sons, that Osric Vane is employed by his firm as a second-year apprentice, that Merrick & Sons held an active work order for boundary fence repairs at Harrowgate yesterday, and that Master Merrick can confirm his crew's ladder inventory came up one short at end of shift last night, a discrepancy he had intended to raise with Mr. Vane this morning. I am satisfied that the individual's account is fully verified. Combined with the confirmed animal intrusion at the east wall, I am declaring both points of the perimeter breach resolved and non-hostile." I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the physical sensation of 4 hours finally being allowed to end. "Condition Amber is downgraded to Condition Green effective immediately," Thorn continued. "All household units may begin controlled stand-down. Family holds remain in place until personally cleared by a household supervisor. I want eyes on confirmation before anyone leaves position. This is not a blanket release. Well done, all of you. That's a long night's work done properly." I do not think I had realized until that moment quite how much of my own body had been braced the entire night, shoulders up near my ears, jaw set, weight balanced on the balls of my feet the way you stand when you expect, at any second, to need to move fast. It took a conscious effort to let it go, the way it always does after a long stretch of readiness, and I was grateful in that moment for the training that had taught me not to let that release happen too fast, too visibly, in front of the two people I was still, technically, on duty to protect. I looked in at Elara first. She had heard every word of Thorn's transmission over Sable's radio, and she had her eyes closed again, briefly, the same gesture she had made when she first heard the word dear, except this time when she opened them, there were tears standing in them that she made no effort at all to hide, not from her son, not from me, not from anyone. "It's over," she said, not quite a question needing, I think, to hear someone else confirm it aloud before she allowed herself to fully believe it. "It's over, Your Highness," I said, Both of them, the deer and the young man with the ladder, neither one had the first idea what they'd set in motion. We'll want a household supervisor to formally clear the room before you're free to move. That's standard, but as far as I'm concerned, you and the prince have been safe this entire night, and you're safe now, and that's the truth of it start to finish. Torin, beside her, let out a breath that seemed to deflate his entire small body at once, the tension of the last 4 hours visibly leaving him all in a rush. And then, in the way children sometimes do, when relief arrives faster than their understanding of it can quite keep pace, he started, very quietly, to cry, not from fear anymore, I think, but from the sheer release of not having to be brave about it a moment longer. Elara pulled him against her without a word, and I stepped back quietly to give them the small privacy the room allowed, and caught Rowan's eye through the gap in the outer door. He had heard his son crying, and I watched him take one step toward the door before visibly stopping himself, waiting, as he had waited all night, for the formal word that would let him through it properly rather than forcing his way past a boundary he had respected for 4 hours already, and clearly did not intend to abandon in the final minutes. It did not take long. A household supervisor, Lieutenant Aveline Corrick, a sharp, no-nonsense officer who had been overseeing the wider stand-down from the operations room, arrived within 10 minutes to formally clear Hold 2, checking the room, checking our reports, checking with visible thoroughness that nothing about the situation had been rushed or assumed rather than confirmed. Only once she had signed off, in the small ledger every hold kept exactly for this purpose, did Sable finally step back from the doorway and say the words I imagine every guard in that corridor had been waiting 4 hours to hear. "You're clear, Your Highness. Lockdown's lifted." Rowan was through the door before the last word had properly left her mouth. I stepped back into the corridor to give the family what room I could, though in a space that small there was only so much distance any of us could put between ourselves and them, and I watched Rowan cross to his wife and son in 3 strides and fold both of them into his arms at once. Torin caught somewhere in the middle of it, still sniffling, already starting to laugh a little at how tightly his father was holding on. I heard him say something into the top of Elara's hair that I did not quite catch and did not try very hard to, because some moments belong to the people having them and not to the guard standing nearby with his hands still, out of long habit, resting near his radio. "A deer," I heard Rowan say, after a moment, pulling back just far enough to look at his son's face. "You're telling me we did all of this because of a deer and a boy who lost a ladder?" "And the boy was really scared," Torin said, with the particular seriousness of someone determined to make sure the full facts of an extraordinary night were properly represented. "Sergeant Hale said he probably thought he was going to get in huge trouble. He was right to think that, given where he chose to go looking for it," Rowan said, though there was no real anger in it, more the exhausted, giddy humor of a man coming down off 4 hours of fear he had not been permitted to fully express. "Remind me to have a word with whoever runs that fencing contract about training their apprentices to leave equipment behind, and simply telephone in the morning like a reasonable person." "I don't think anyone trains apprentices for that, sir," I offered, and it drew a short, surprised laugh out of him, the first real one I had heard from him all night. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose they do." It was perhaps 20 minutes later, once the family had been escorted back to Elara's own apartments, and the household had begun the long, unglamorous work of standing every unit down from a 4-hour posture of readiness. That word came through that King Alaric wished to see the family personally before the morning was out. Not as a formality, I understood from the way the message was relayed, but because he had spent the same 4 hours secured in his own wing with Queen Consort Morwenna, receiving the same fragmented updates the rest of us had, and had been, by every account I heard afterward, every bit as frightened for his grandson and daughter-in-law as any of the guards standing watch outside their door. I was still posted outside Elara's apartments an hour later, technically off the immediate protection rotation now that condition green had been fully confirmed, but kept on station a while longer at Captain Voss's request, while the wider grounds finished being swept and cleared, when King Alaric arrived, still in a dressing gown thrown hastily over his night clothes. Moving at a pace I had rarely seen a man of his years and dignity move at, with Queen Consort Morwenna a step behind him and looking, I thought, nearly as shaken as he did. He did not stand on any ceremony at the door. He simply went in, and I heard, through the opening and closing of it, the particular warmth of a family checking each other over with their own eyes rather than trusting any report, however reassuring, second-hand. I did not intrude on that either. But Commander Thorn found me not long after, making his way down the corridor with the specific, unhurried purposefulness of a man who had one more piece of business to attend to before he would allow himself to consider the night finished. And he stopped in front of me with an expression I had not seen on him before, something that might, on a less composed man, have been close to relief showing openly on the face. "Sergeant Hale," he said, "walk with me a moment." I fell into step beside him, and he did not speak again until we were well clear of the family's corridor, in the quieter stretch of hallway that ran past the old library. "I want your honest assessment," he said, "not the report, the honest version." I thought about it for a moment, because I owed him something better than a reflexive answer. "Honestly, sir, it worked. Every piece of it. We didn't know what was out there, and for a while it looked like it might be worse than it turned out to be, and at no point did anyone cut a corner because the odds seemed to be improving. Dresk didn't call it clear until he had eyes on the animal and confirmation the timing didn't add up for a second sensor. You didn't stand anyone down on a plausible story. You stood us down on a confirmed phone call. If it had been something worse than a boy and his ladder, I think we'd have been ready for that too." Thorn nodded slowly, and for a moment he did not say anything at all, simply looked back down the corridor toward the family's apartments, where a thin line of lamplight still showed under the door. "19 years I've run security here," he said eventually. "You develop a certain instinct for when a protocol is theater and when it's real. Plenty of what we do is theater, if I'm honest with you, Sergeant. The ceremonial postings, the parade formations, half of what tourists photograph. Necessary theater, mind, it has its purpose. But condition amber isn't theater. Tonight is exactly what it exists for, and I will tell you, watching it run from the operations room, not one person on this channel put a foot wrong. Not one. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because a great many people took a great many boring nights seriously enough, for a great many years, that when the one night that wasn't boring finally came, nobody had to think about what to do next. They already knew. I did not have a ready answer for that, and I do not think he expected one. We walked the rest of the corridor in a silence that felt, for the first time in hours, entirely comfortable. It was closer to dawn by the time I learned what had become of Osric Vane, and I learned it, again, from Dresk, who had stayed with the young man through the whole of his formal questioning, and had appointed himself, somewhere along the way, an unofficial advocate for a boy he had every professional reason to have treated with considerably more suspicion than he ultimately did. "They're not charging him with anything serious," Dresk told me, over the first mug of tea either of us had managed since the alarm sounded. "Trespass on restricted grounds during a declared security event is technically an offense, and Commander Thorn's not going to pretend it isn't. The lad needs to understand what he set in motion, and I think he understands it better than anyone could explain to him at this point. He's been apologizing for 3 hours straight, but Thorn's recommending it go through as a formal caution rather than anything that follows him for the rest of his life. No court date. No record that'll cost him his apprenticeship, assuming Merrick doesn't sack him over the ladder itself, which, frankly, is the part the boy seems more frightened of than anything the palace might do to him." "He kept the ladder the whole time?" I asked, because it was, even hours later, the detail I found hardest to fully believe. "Wouldn't let it out of his sight," Dresk said, with the particular fond exasperation of a man who had spent half the night dealing with someone else's very earnest, very poorly judged decision-making. "Had it under his arm right up until Thorne's people photographed him for the file. I told him, son, I have personally never in my life seen a piece of aluminum guarded so devotedly. He didn't think it was funny at the time. He might in a year or two." I found myself, oddly, glad to hear it, glad that the core response to a night of genuine fear had not curdled, in its aftermath, into something harsher than the situation actually warranted. It would have been easy, I think, for tired, adrenaline-worn guards to treat a frightened 19-year-old roughly once the danger had passed, and the anger that follows fear had room to surface. That it did not happen, that Dresk and the others who handled him treated Osric Vane's genuine, foolish mistake with something closer to weary sympathy than punishment, struck me as its own small proof of the same discipline Thorn had been talking about in the corridor. It is one thing to hold your composure under threat. It is another thing entirely to hold it once the threat has passed, and you are left facing only an ordinary, apologetic young man who cost you the worst night of your month for the sake of an 80-pound ladder. I think of the two, the second kind of discipline is very often the harder one to manage, precisely because nobody drills for it the way they drill for the first. By the time the sky over Harrowgate had properly begun to lighten, the storm had blown itself out somewhere over the eastern hills, leaving the kitchen gardens looking, when I finally had a chance to walk past them on my way toward the guardroom, like the aftermath of a much smaller drama than the one that had actually played out, a stretch of trampled cabbages, a section of hedge crushed nearly flat, 8 meters of snapped fencing already marked off with tape for the maintenance crew who would come to repair it properly once the ground had dried enough to work. The Red Stag itself had been quietly freed from the tangle of fallen wire sometime before dawn, by a groundskeeper experienced enough with livestock to manage it without further injury to the animal or himself, and had bounded off into the tree line beyond the eastern boundary looking, by every account I heard, considerably less troubled by the whole affair than any of the humans it had inadvertently terrified. I stood at the edge of that trampled garden for a minute or two longer than I strictly needed to, in the thin gray light of a morning that had cost the household 4 hours of genuine fear over the combined efforts of one frightened animal and one frightened boy, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time in my career, and certainly not for the last, about how strange it is that the job of a guard is measured almost entirely in things that do not happen. Nobody would ever write a headline about the night nothing occurred. No one outside the Corps itself would ever fully understand what it had taken, the years of drilling, the boring nights logged one after another, until the habits became instinct, the willingness of 5 armed adults to stand in a ring around a woman and her son for 4 hours over a threat that turned out in the end to be nothing at all, to make sure that nothing happened, was the only headline the night would ever produce. That, I have come to believe, is the whole of the trade, laid bare. We are not paid in the end to be right about how dangerous a night will turn out to be. We are paid to treat every night as though it might be the dangerous one, so that on the nights it actually is, nobody in our care ever has to find out what happens when we didn't. I was not expecting to see any of the family again before my shift finally ended, and I would have been perfectly content with that. A guard's job, done well, is largely invisible by design, and I had long since made peace with the fact that most of my best work would never be witnessed by the people it protected. But at a little past 8 that morning, with the sun properly up and the last of the storm clouds breaking apart over the eastern hills, a page found me in the guardroom and informed me that Princess Elara had asked whether I might be free for a few minutes before I went off duty. I found her in the small private sitting room off her apartments, still in the same robe from the night before, though she had clearly washed and settled somewhat in the intervening hours, and Torin was with her, dressed now, sitting cross-legged on the window seat with a mug of something warm cupped in both hands, looking, but for the faint shadows under his eyes, remarkably like an ordinary 11-year-old boy on an ordinary morning. "Sergeant Hale," Elara said, rising as I came in, which was itself enough to make me faintly uncomfortable, because it is not, generally speaking, protocol for a princess to stand for a sergeant, and I think she knew it and did it anyway on purpose. "I wanted to thank you properly, while it was still fresh, before the whole thing turns into a story we tell at dinner parties, and I forget to actually say it." "You don't need to thank me, Your Highness. It's the job." "It's the job," she agreed, "and you did it extraordinarily well, and those two things are not in conflict, so I'm going to thank you regardless." She said it with enough dry humor that I found myself smiling despite the mild embarrassment of the moment. "You told my son the truth all night, when I imagine it would have been easier more than once to tell him something softer instead. I noticed." "He noticed too, though he might not be able to explain to you exactly what he noticed or why it mattered." Torin, from the window seat, looked up at that with the particular affronted dignity of a boy who did not appreciate being discussed, as though he could not follow the conversation perfectly well himself. "I could explain it," he said. "It's because when someone tells you the truth, even when it's scary, you believe them the next time they tell you it's going to be all right. If they only ever tell you nice things, you can't tell which ones are real." I looked at him for a moment, genuinely a little startled, because it was about as precise an articulation of something I had spent 14 years learning through trial and error as I had ever heard from anyone, let alone an 11-year-old, less than 6 hours removed from the worst fright of his young life. "That's exactly it, Your Highness," I said. "I couldn't have put it better myself." "I've had a lot of time to think about it," Torin said, with a shrug that suggested he considered several hours locked in a windowless room reasonable grounds for developing a fully formed philosophy of trust, which I suppose it was. Elara's expression, watching her son, was a complicated one, pride and lingering worry and something like wonder all moving across it at once, the particular look of a parent recognizing, in the middle of an ordinary morning, that the child in front of them has quietly become someone slightly different, slightly older, than the child who went to bed the night before. "He asked this morning whether he could meet the young man who set the whole thing off," she said, turning back to me. "The apprentice." I wasn't certain it was appropriate to ask, but I understand Commander Thorn has him at the palace still, finishing his statement, and I thought if it could be arranged, quietly, and if the young man himself was willing, it might do them both some good. I was not, in truth, entirely sure what to make of the request when I first heard it, and I told her as much. "I can ask Commander Thorn, Your Highness, though I'll be honest, it's not a usual thing to arrange." "May I ask why?" "Because he's going to spend the rest of his life being the young man who nearly caused an international incident over a ladder," Elara said. "And I'd rather my son's first real experience of a security frightening, as this one was, be tempered with the memory that the person on the other end of it turned out to be an ordinary, foolish, frightened boy and not a monster. I think that matters more than people give it credit for. And selfishly, I think it would do Osric some good too, to know that the family he terrified half to death doesn't actually hold it against him." It took a little over an hour to arrange, working through Commander Thorn and eventually a rather bewildered Osric Vane himself, who by every account nearly refused outright out of sheer mortification before Dresk, who had, by that point, appointed himself something close to the boy's guardian for the duration of the ordeal, talked him into it on the grounds that turning down an invitation from the Crown Prince's wife was, whatever else might be said about the situation, almost certainly worse manners than the trespassing itself. I was present for it, at Elara's request, standing near the door of the same small sitting room while Osric Vane was shown in, still faintly damp around the collar from a night that had not yet given him a chance to properly dry out or sleep, his eyes fixed somewhere around knee-height as though he could not quite bring himself to look directly at either the princess or her son. "Your Highness," he managed, and then seemed to run entirely out of further words, which I understood completely, having watched a great many people freeze up in front of that family over the years, though rarely with quite so much genuine anguish behind it. "Mr. Vane," Elara said, and there was nothing but warmth in it, no trace of the fear or fury he had clearly been bracing himself for. "I understand you had rather an eventful night." "I am so sorry, Your Highness, I never meant. I didn't know there'd be an alarm. I didn't think anyone would even notice. I know that's not an excuse. I know I frightened everyone. You did frighten everyone," she agreed, gently but without softening the truth of it, in a way that struck me, watching, as very much of a piece with the way I had tried to speak to her son the night before. "Quite badly, for a few hours. I won't pretend otherwise, because I don't think pretending would do either of us any good. But I also understand you came back for a ladder you were afraid of losing, and that you meant no harm to anyone, and I wanted you to hear directly from me that I believe that, and that I'm not angry with you, even though I was very frightened last night, in no small part because of what you did." Osric's composure, such as it had been holding together up to that point, seemed to genuinely crack at that, and I watched a 19-year-old boy who had spent a terrifying night in the custody of armed palace guards nearly come undone entirely in front of the very family he had frightened, not from fear this time, but from something closer to overwhelmed relief. "I'll pay for the fence," he said, a little wildly. "I'll pay for all of it. I don't care how long it takes. The fence is not your responsibility, Mr. Vane, unless you've recently taken up work as a red stag," Elara said, dry enough that it startled a short, wet laugh out of the boy despite himself. "And I'm told your employer already has quite firm opinions about the latter without my needing to add to them. What I would actually like, if you're willing, is for you to meet my son, who insisted on this meeting rather more than I did, and who has a few questions for you, I believe." Torin, who had been sitting quietly through all of this with the careful attentiveness of a boy determined not to miss a single detail of an experience he clearly understood to be unusual, slid off the window seat, and crossed the room to stand in front of Osric with the direct, unself-conscious curiosity only children seem able to summon in situations that would leave most adults tongue-tied. "Were you scared," he asked, "when the guard's torch found you?" "Yes, Your Highness," Osric said, with a bluntness that seemed to surprise even him. "Very scared. I genuinely thought I might not walk out of that garden." "I was scared too," Torin said. "I thought maybe someone was trying to hurt my family. I didn't know it was just you and a deer." "I'm sorry," Osric said again, and this time it sounded less like an apology offered on reflex and more like one that had actually landed somewhere it needed to. "It's all right," Torin said, with the particular easy generosity of a child for whom the night's terror had, in the bright light of morning, already begun to soften into something closer to an extraordinary story he would tell for years. "Sergeant Hale said the silliest reasons are usually the true ones. I think you're proof of that. It was, I think, the single finest thing I heard said by anyone that entire night and morning combined, and I watched something in Osric Vane's shoulders ease, just slightly, for what was probably the first time since Dresk's torch had found him crouched behind those terracotta pots some 6 hours earlier. He left not long after, walked out by Dresk himself, who I later learned had quietly arranged for one of the palace kitchens to send the boy off with something hot to eat before the long drive back to Aldbury, on the reasoning, as Dresk put it to me afterward, that a lad who's had the fright of his life and hasn't slept deserves a decent breakfast more than he deserves another lecture, and he'd had quite enough lectures by that point from Merrick himself over the telephone. King Alaric, I learned later that same day, had personally telephoned Master Tobias Merrick to confirm, in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, that the palace held no grievance whatsoever against either the firm or its apprentice, and that he trusted the matter of the latter, and Osric's continued employment would be handled with proportion rather than punishment. Whether that call was strictly necessary I could not say, but I understood, hearing about it, that it was very much in keeping with everything else I had watched that family do in the hours since the alarm first sounded. A household that took its own safety with the utmost seriousness, and extended, once that safety had been confirmed and secured, a very particular kind of grace to the ordinary, harmless people who had briefly and unwittingly disrupted it. The formal debrief for the household detail was held 2 days later, once the necessary reports had been filed, and Commander Thorn had finished reviewing every transmission on the overnight channel with the exacting thoroughness I had come to expect from him. It took place in the long briefing room off the guardroom. All of us who had been on duty that night crowded around the same scarred table where I had sat through 100 less consequential meetings over the years, and I remember being struck, looking around at the faces there, by how ordinary everyone looked in the plain light of an autumn afternoon. Sable, with a mug of tea going cold at her elbow, dressed still faintly sunburned from a training exercise the week before. Corrigan doodling absently on the corner of his notepad, the way he always did when he was actually listening very closely to something. How little any of us resembled the tense, focused figures we had been standing in that corridor 4 nights earlier. Commander Thorn did not waste time on preamble. He rarely did. "I've reviewed the full transcript," he said, standing at the head of the table with a folder he did not once open, because I do not believe he needed to. Sensor trigger to full stand down, 4 hours and 11 minutes. In that time, this detail secured 2 members of the royal family, maintained continuous communication discipline, escalated appropriately when new information demanded it, and de-escalated only once every element of the threat had been independently confirmed rather than merely assumed. I want to be plain about something, because I think it's easy, after a night like that ends in nothing worse than a spooked deer and a frightened apprentice, to feel almost sheepish about how seriously it was all taken. Don't feel sheepish. You did not know, at any point between the first alarm and Master Merrick's phone call, that this would end harmlessly. You could not have known, and you conducted yourselves throughout as though it might not, which is precisely and exactly what the protocol exists to produce. He looked around the table for a moment before continuing, and I noticed he let his gaze rest briefly on each of us in turn: Sable, Dresk, Corrigan, myself, Garrett Voss, the handful of others who had rotated through the perimeter sweep, and the corridor watch over those 4 hours. "I have served this household for 19 years, he said. "I have seen protocols written, revised, and occasionally abandoned when someone senior decided they were too cumbersome for ordinary use. Condition Amber has never once been abandoned in all that time, no matter how many false alarms it has produced along the way, and believe me, there have been false alarms before this one, plenty of them, weather and wildlife and the occasional overzealous new recruit setting off a sensor by accident. The temptation, after enough false alarms, is always to relax the response a little, to assume the next one will be nothing too, because the last dozen were. This detail did not do that. You treated Tuesday night with exactly the same seriousness you would have brought to the worst night any of us can imagine, right up until the facts themselves told you it was safe to stand down, and not 1 second sooner. That is the entire job, done correctly, and I wanted you to hear directly from me that I know it, and that His Majesty knows it too. That last part, I learned, was not merely a figure of speech. King Alaric had asked to be informed personally of the debrief's outcome, and 2 days after that, in a gesture that I understood from older guards was not entirely without precedent, but was rare enough that it drew genuine surprise from everyone in the guardroom. He came to see us himself, without any great ceremony, simply appearing at the door of the briefing room one afternoon with Commander Thorn a step behind him, and asking in the plain, unhurried way I would come to associate with him over the years that followed, whether he might have a few minutes of our time. I will not pretend I remember every word he said, because I was, if I am honest, rather too preoccupied in the moment with the strangeness of a king standing in our briefing room at all to catalog his remarks with perfect accuracy. But I remember the substance of it clearly enough, and I remember, most of all, the specific thing he said near the end, because I have carried it with me ever since, through every ordinary, uneventful night I have stood watch in the years since that one wasn't. "I am told," he said, "that my grandson asked one of you, partway through that night, whether you were frightened, and that you told him the truth rather than what might have been easier to say. I want you to understand that this matters to me a very great deal, more in some ways, than the fact that you executed the protocol correctly, though of course that matters enormously too. My grandson will grow up, one day, into responsibilities considerably heavier than the ones he carries now, and the habits of trust he builds in moments like the one you gave him will follow him the whole of his life. You did not simply keep him physically safe that night, though you did that, and I am more grateful for it than I know how to properly express. You also showed him what it looks like to be told the truth by someone whose only interest was his welfare, in the middle of the one night in his life when he most needed to be able to believe what he was told. That is not a small thing. I do not think it is a thing we train for precisely, though perhaps we ought to try harder to. I think it is simply a thing some people carry in them, and I am glad, more than I can easily say, that the people standing between my family and whatever danger the world sends our way happen to be the sort who carry it. I did not know, in that moment, quite what to do with being spoken to that way by a king, and I do not think anyone else in the room did either, judging by the general, slightly stunned silence that followed. But I have thought about those words a great many times since, on quieter nights than that one, standing posts where nothing at all happened and nothing at all was likely to, and I have come to understand them, I think, as close to the truest description of the job I have ever heard anyone give. The eastern fence line was fully repaired within the week, the 8 snapped posts replaced with new ones, and the whole weakened stretch reinforced beyond what it had been before the storm found its way through it. And the sensor grid along that section was upgraded not long after to distinguish more reliably between an animal's gait and a person's. A small, unglamorous improvement that I understood, from the way Commander Thorne spoke of it afterward. Mattered to him more than almost any commendation the Corps received that season. He had a habit, I came to learn over the years I served under him, of treating every incident, however harmless its resolution, as an opportunity to make the next one easier to read correctly and faster to resolve, and I think that habit, more than any single night's heroics, is the real reason Harrowgate's protection detail earned the reputation it did. Osric Vane, I am glad to report, kept both his apprenticeship and, eventually, something considerably better than his dignity. Master Merrick, whatever his opinions on lost ladders, proved a fairer man than his reputation suggested once the full circumstances had been laid in front of him, and docked the cost of the ladder from 3 weeks' wages rather than the boy's future, a sentence Osric apparently accepted with visible relief and no small amount of gratitude. Dress kept up an occasional gruff correspondence with him for a year or two afterward, the sort that consists mostly of a card at midwinter and the odd bit of news passed along second-hand, and I heard, the last I asked after him, that he had finished his apprenticeship in good standing, and taken on 2 apprentices of his own not long after, with what Dresk assured me, laughing, was an absolutely fanatical policy about accounting for every last tool before any van left a job site. Storm or no storm, Torin, for his part, grew from that night the way children grow from the frightening things that happen to them and resolve well, not unmarked by it, exactly, because I do not think any child forgets 4 hours spent believing, even briefly, that someone might mean his family harm, but not diminished by it either. I watched him over the years that followed, on the rare occasions duty brought me back into his orbit, grow steadier, more curious about the guards around him rather than less, full of questions about protocol and training that I answered as honestly as I had answered his questions that first frightened night, because it had worked once, and I saw no reason to abandon it. He asked me once, a year or two later, whether I thought he would make a good guard himself one day, and I told him truthfully that I thought he already understood the most important part of the job better than most recruits twice his age did by the time they finished training, that the whole of it is choosing, night after uneventful night, to be ready anyway. I think of that lockdown often, more often if I am honest, the nights considerably more dramatic than it turned out to be, and I have come to understand why. It was not dramatic in the retelling. Nobody was hurt. No villain was ever unmasked, because there was no villain to unmask, only a spooked animal and a frightened boy who made an ordinary, forgivable mistake at the worst possible hour. If you were to reduce that night to its plainest facts, stripped of everything I have just told you, it would sound almost absurd. An entire royal household locked down for 4 hours because a deer ran through a fence, and an apprentice came back for a ladder. I understand why it might be tempting to hear it that way and laugh, and there is nothing wrong with laughing at it now, all these years later, the way Torin himself learned to laugh at it long before I did. But I do not think that is the true measure of what that night was. The true measure of it is this: for 4 hours, nobody knew for certain that it would end harmlessly. Not Commander Thorn in the operations room, refusing to call it clear on the strength of a plausible story. Not Dresk, walking toward a lit window in a garden shed with no way of knowing what waited on the other side of it. Not Sable, standing in a doorway between a princess and a corridor she could not see the end of. Not Rowan, sitting on the floor of that corridor with his back against the stone, waiting for permission to reach his own family. Not me, crouched down at eye level with a frightened 11-year-old boy, telling him the truth because I believed, and still believe, that the truth was the one thing I had to offer him that no amount of danger could take back once it was given. We did not know it would end well. We only knew what to do while we waited to find out, and we did it, every one of us, without a single corner cut. Because that is what 14 years and 19 years and however many years the rest of the Corps had put into the job before that night had built into all of us long before the alarm ever sounded. That, I have come to believe, is the entire secret of this work, if it can even be called a secret at all, since it is really nothing more than the plainest kind of discipline, repeated so many times over so many ordinary nights that by the time it is finally tested, there is nothing left to decide. The decision was already made, years earlier, one boring shift at a time. I am older now than I was that autumn, closer to the end of my service than the beginning of it, and I have stood a great many posts since, through weather considerably worse than that storm and nights considerably longer than that one. Most of them, like most of any guard's career, ended in nothing at all, which is, as I have said, the whole point, and which I no longer find even slightly disappointing to report. I think often of young guards coming up through the ranks now, standing their first long, uneventful shifts and wondering, as I once did, whether any of it matters if nothing ever happens. I tell them what Commander Thorn told me in that quiet corridor the morning after the lockdown lifted, because I have never heard it put better. The boring nights are not the absence of the job. They are the job, laid down one shift at a time, so that when the one night finally comes that is not boring at all, nobody standing in that ring has to stop and decide, for the first time, what kind of guard they intend to be. I know now what became of that particular night in the long history of the household. A story told, eventually, with real fondness at family gatherings, Torin's own favorite version of it growing more theatrical with every retelling of the deer, and the ladder and the boy who very nearly caused an international incident over 80 pounds of aluminum. I know that the fence held strong through every storm that followed it, that the sensor grid never again mistook a startled animal for something worse than it was, and that Elara, to this day, keeps a small, private habit of thanking whoever stands the overnight post outside her door quietly before she retires each evening, a courtesy I have never heard of any other member of that household extending, and one I suspect began that particular night and simply never stopped. And I know this, most of all, because it is the part of the story I have carried longest and valued most, that on a night when nothing that happened was ever truly dangerous, a great many people behaved exactly as though it might be, and that is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything the core exists to be. We do not stand our posts because we expect the worst every single night. We stand them because we cannot know, until it is over, which night the worst might have arrived on, and because the surest way to make certain a family never has to find out is to be standing there, ready, steady, and telling the truth, on every single ordinary night until the day, at last, that we are not needed to be anything more than that at all.